just taken their money and they just left them. Now he starts on murder.
It really was like an Agatha Christie novel. It was full of intrigue.
On scenes of crime, men who kill their wives. Stories of greed and deceit. The seaside resorts of Edwardian England were the fertile hunting ground for a serial bigamist and murderer, George Joseph Smith.
Well, Smith created this wonderful image for himself. He would appear in these seaside resorts as a man about town, very charming, wearing a straw boater, blazer, white flannels. In fact, a quite debonair figure. However, he was more like a shark, a predatory shark, cruising these hunting grounds looking for susceptible women.
Smith was a very keen suitor. He would woo vulnerable single women, getting them to fall under his spell with promises of marriage.
The essence of every lady was to get married, was to find a husband, because that brought with it a respectability. Most women would be looking for a husband, and they would be quite prepared to take any sort of man, whether it was an older man or it was a good-looking man or an ugly man, it didn't matter. If they could marry, whatever happened after that was sometimes irrelevant. But a man who came along who professed love towards them and affection towards them, they had a bit of money and he needed a bit of money to start a business, and she would only too pleased to help her husband to get started, etc., etc.
Stuart Evans is a crime writer and historian with a special interest in the Smith case.
Well, George Joseph Smith was a Cockney. He was born in Bethnal Green, and he came from a respectable family. His father was an insurance agent, and one would have thought he would have been a respectable lad, but unfortunately, from a very early age, he was difficult and was obviously not going to be what his parents would have perhaps desired. And in fact, he was thieving at a very early age, and at the age of 9 years, he was put in a reformatory until he was 16. So he was a thoroughly bad character from an early age, and things didn't really get any better.
Smith was a charmer. Using the alias Oliver Love, he married Caroline Thornhill, his only legitimate wife. He promised her wealth and fortune if she would take some menial jobs as a maid in various seaside towns.
He actually got her to steal from the people she was working for. She was caught, she was put in prison for a year, and subsequently when she got out she realised that she'd been led astray and she wasn't too keen on staying with Smith and was a bit worried about him, so she in fact emigrated to Canada.
Caroline Thornhill was lucky to escape. They never divorced, but that didn't stop Smith remarrying several times, each time under an alias. He moved to Bristol, set up a second-hand shop and advertised for a housekeeper. Edith Pegler replied, and she was soon in his clutches. They married under his real name of George Joseph Smith in July 1908.
Now, Edith Pegler was interesting because, again, from whatever happened afterwards, he always came back to Edith. She was the one constant in his life, so there probably was some sort of relationship there, a meaningful relationship.
Smith was often away from Edith for long periods. He claimed he was looking for stock for their antique shop. In 1910 he met Bessie Mundy, daughter of a wealthy bank manager. They married in a Weymouth registry office under the name of Henry Williams.
He'd already established that she'd inherited £2,500, which was a huge amount of money in those days, although it was held in trust.
Smith knew he couldn't get his hands on her inheritance while she was still alive, so he left her.
He wrote a letter to Bessie claiming that he had caught venereal disease, implying that it probably was from her, and he had to go away to have this cleared up and to take treatment and to get it all sorted out, etc., etc., and then he just disappeared.
In fact, he went back to Bristol to Edith Pegler. 18 months later, he bumped into Bessie on the seafront at Weston-super-Mare.
She sees this man and walks up to him, and she's Henry, and it is George Joseph Smith. Henry Williams, her husband. He then tells her a cock-a-bull story about how he'd been looking for her, he'd lost her, and he'd been for months and months searching the country for her, and it was all a misunderstanding and all this business. And this poor lady, again, a lonely lady who needed a bit of love in her life, was quite prepared to accept his story and take him back, and they resumed as husband and wife again for a very short time. But he realised he couldn't get his hand on her money because it was in trust. Now, up until then, all the women he'd just taken their money and then just left them. Now he starts on murder.
Smith and Bessie moved to Herne Bay in the summer of 1912. But the scheme of fleecing his wives was about to take a more sinister turn.
Having moved to Herne Bay with Bessie, they saw their lawyer. Mutual wills were made so that everything would be left to him if anything happened. They also visited the doctor because he persuaded her she was suffering from fits. And having done all this, he went off to a local ironmonger and purchased a tin bath, which he had put into the house. Well, within a very short time, she was found drowned in the bath, clutching a bar of soap in her hand.
An inquest was held into the death of Bessie Mundy. The verdict was death by misadventure. Smith got his inheritance of £2,500, a considerable sum at the time. He was now a wealthy man.
And to make maximum money from the event, Smith actually returned the bath to the ironmonger and got his money back.
Smith returned to Edith Pegler again, but this time for only 12 months. In November 1913, using his own name, Smith married Alice Burnham. That marriage was to last just over a month. They moved to a lodging house in Blackpool run by Mr. and Mrs. Crossley.
On the evening of Friday the 12th of December 1913, his wife decided she would take a bath. At this time, Mrs. Crossley was in the kitchen below, and she heard the sounds of the woman taking a bath and noticed a stain on the ceiling. She then heard Smith shout that he couldn't get his wife to respond. The doctor was called out, the same doctor that had been visited, and she was found to be dead in the bath, apparently drowned whilst having a fit. The inquest was held, and again death by misadventure was returned. Smith received his £500 insurance money, and he returned to Edith yet again.
The circumstances of Alice's death again did not cause official concern.
Young bride found dead in the bath, obviously a seizure or something like this, and in fact he gets away with it again. The certificate is written, no suspicion of foul play, it's just a young lady dying in a bath. But he was so cold and calculating, the Crossleys did not like him at all.
Smith married twice more. A year later, using the name John Lloyd, he married his seventh wife in December 1914. Margaret Lofty had been unlucky in love. She was just getting over a broken relationship with a man who turned out to be married.
They moved into lodgings in Highgate, and there, obviously there was a bathroom which suited his plans admirably, and also he insured her in the sum of £700 this time. The usual visit to the doctor followed, where he explained his wife was subject to fits. The lawyer was seen, and he made sure the wills were tied up, and that should anything unfortunately happen, the money would be left to him.
But this is where he really got greedy and got silly, because he killed Miss Lofty. He killed her the day after they were married. Now he's now got to the stage you won't even go through of living with them for 3 or 4 months. He killed her the very day after they were married.
A national newspaper ran the story. Alice Burnham's father saw it. He was shocked to learn that another young bride had died in a similar way to his daughter. He contacted the police, who opened an inquiry into the suspicious deaths. Smith was arrested and tried at the Old Bailey. At the trial, a pathologist demonstrated how the women could have died in the baths.
Smith, the lady would be in the bath, having a bath, his wife, his bride. He would come in. He would perhaps gently stroke her on the head very affectionately. But while he was doing that, while she was sitting in the bath, he would place his hands under her knees. Right? He would then push down, in like a rocking movement, pull up her knees, but push her down. Now, she knows she's going under the water, so she'll take a breath. and then he holds her under the water. Now, she, at this point, was trying to struggle, but it's a very narrow, tight bath. She hasn't got much movement. And he holds her, and he's much stronger than she is, so he holds her under, probably minute and a half, till her lungs are bursting. And then he will pull her back up again. She's now just enough to take a breath, right? And then he'll push her back again, and hold her under again for another minute and a half. And just keep doing that. Right? Now, eventually, this lady becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. And eventually, what happens, they die of shock. They die of fright. And that is vagal inhibition, attack of the central nervous system. You can die of fright and you can die of shock. And that, it's really suspected, is what happened to these ladies.
The trial caused such a controversy that the bloodiest campaigns of the First World War were knocked off the front pages of the newspapers.
The public gallery was packed out with ladies who'd queued for hours and hours and hours to get in. And I think probably because they wanted to know what this man had. They wanted to see what this man looked like.
George Joseph Smith was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He was hanged in Maidstone Jail on Friday the 13th of August, 1915.
It really was like an Agatha Christie novel. It was full of intrigue.
At this lay-by near Nuneaton in 1994, a twisted story of murder and deception unfolded. Here, Gordon Wardell dumped the dead body of his wife, Carol. The police were presented with a complicated puzzle to unravel. Detective Superintendent Tony Bayliss revisits the scene where these extraordinary events began.
On the morning concern, Carol's body was lying just here on the edge of the verge, more or less in full view of all the passing traffic.
There had been no attempt to hide it in the ditch or over the hedge which was nearby. The top half of the body was partly exposed. One of the features was the fact that one of her sandals was missing.
Reports soon reached Tony Bayliss of another incident in Nuneaton's town centre.
It was then that an officer drew to our attention that the sandal which he'd seen on the foot of the body here was very similar to a sandal that officers were describing that was lying in the middle of the floor in the Woolwich Building Society. So it was at that stage we were beginning to link the 2 incidents together.
It wasn't long before police found out more information about their victim. Carol Wardell was the 39-year-old assistant manageress at the Woolwich Building Society in Nuneaton. At this stage, it looked like a classic case of a robbery gone wrong.
It was just before 9 o'clock this morning that a man on his way to work discovered Carol Wardell's body beside bushes in a lay-by. Police at the scene said it appeared it had been dumped from a vehicle.
Police were unable to make contact with Carol's husband, Gordon. They visited their home.
And at around 2 o'clock, my colleague, Detective Inspector Variali, went to the house and the back door was ajar and he heard murmuring from inside, walked into the lounge and found Gordon Wardell tied up with plastic ties to a bin liner, and he was conveyed to hospital. The bin liner frame which Gordon was tied up to was a metal structure, the sort of thing that you'd probably have out in the garden that you put a black sack in. We've got 3 crime scenes, 3 major crime scenes. The lay-by on the A444. We've got the building society where it appears there's been a robbery, and we've got the victim's home. So a pretty serious crime, and it quickly generated a lot of national media interest.
Mr. Wardell said that as he walked into the living room, he was confronted by the sight of a man wearing a clown's mask, holding a knife to his wife's throat. It was the last he saw of her. He told police he was grabbed from the side and behind and manhandled to the ground.
Within 24 hours of Carol's body being found, the police discovered something in Gordon's past that immediately raised their suspicions. As a 17-year-old, He'd been charged with a brutal attack on his schoolteacher's wife. She'd nearly died.
The next key phases of the investigation is when we asked Gordon to appear at a press conference to appeal for his wife's killers to come forward.
The man had got hold of my wife and was threatening her with a knife.
And his thoughts about the killers?
Totally evil.
That probably was a turning point in the investigation because it certainly focused a lot of attention on Gordon.
The press had also found out about his past.
Mr. Wardell was asked about a 4-year jail sentence he served for stabbing the wife of one of his schoolteachers when he was 17. Mr. Wardell said it was irrelevant.
My main interest is to catch the killers of my wife, not what I did.
Gordon's innocence and his version of events were now very much in question. The police persuaded him to take part in a filmed reconstruction of his movements on the night of Carol's death.
He and his wife had had Sunday lunch. At 8 o'clock time, she'd asked him if he could pop out and post a letter. And then decided to call him for a pint at the Brooklands pub on the way home. He said he had a couple of pints in the pub, got back just after 9 o'clock at the house, opened the front door, walked inside and saw his wife sat on the sofa with a person wearing a clown's mask sat next to her with a knife to her throat.
Gordon Wardell claimed he was attacked by a gang of men. He then blacked out in the hallway.
And the next thing he remembers was hearing the milkman clanking bottles, which would have been about 6 o'clock the next morning.
But cracks in Gordon's story were beginning to show.
The first seeds of doubt about his account came when we received information on the Tuesday that he'd got this previous conviction, because he hadn't mentioned this at all. Initial inquiries being made at the Brooklands pub and places like that, and those initial inquiries weren't throwing up anybody who'd seen him. And we made extensive inquiries in and around the post office where he went to post the letter. We saw all the customers and staff at the Brooklands pub who were on duty.
Mr. Wardell said he hoped the police would make a breakthrough soon.
Hopefully, yes. That's why I'm trying to do anything that I can to help.
Nobody had seen him in that pub having a drink that night, and he is a sort of guy who would probably stand out, especially as he didn't go in there very often.
I didn't serve the man, and all the staff have signed police statements to say they don't recall seeing it.
And it was at that point, really, that we had to start thinking of Gordon as a possible suspect. Extensive scenes of crime work had been done at the house. There was no forced entry to the house, and every item which was used to secure Gordon was from within the garage or the house itself. Now, you know, it stretches the imagination to believe that a professional team of villains would arrive on a sort of kidnapping and robbery escapade like this, bringing no wherewithal with them, no rope, no handcuffs, no gagging material, tape or anything to tie him up. Everything had been taken from the garage or the house itself.
Thursday the 20th of October 1994. Gordon Wardell was arrested at his home. The following week he was charged with murdering his wife, Carol, and robbing the Woolwich Building Society.
Well, what we subsequently established was that the two sandals were indeed a pair of Carol's sandals, and obviously what Gordon had done was to leave one sandal on the body and put one in the Building Society to enable us to link the two together. He wanted this body found so we could go to the house and find him.
Despite having only circumstantial evidence against Gordon, the police and the Crown Prosecution Service agreed that they had a strong enough case to take to court. But exactly what happened to Carol that night could never be proved.
There was no conclusive forensic evidence which identified the exact location of where Carol was murdered. My view is she was probably killed at home, and I believe that Gordon probably took her body in the car and probably in the front seat, strapped in like a sleeping passenger, for the want of a better expression. But I would assume that he probably went to the Building Society first, leaving her dead in his car whilst he undid the safe and made it look like a robbery, and then disposed of her body, and then drove home and waited for the opportunity to tie himself up.
What was certain was how she died. Carol Wardell had been suffocated. Throughout the murder investigation, the main challenge the police faced was proving Gordon Wardell's crimes to a jury.
And that's why it took so long, you know, when all the public were thinking, what are they doing about it's obviously the husband. We were wanting to make sure that his account wasn't right, basically. It basically was a domestic murder which had either been planned or some serious planning had gone on immediately afterwards to try and cover it up in the way that we all know about.
Whether premeditated or not, the murder of Carol Wardell was nevertheless a calculated act by a man with a violent history. At Oxford Crown Court, Gordon Wardell, still protesting his innocence, received a life sentence for murder.
He never admitted to the offence. In fact, I've been back to see him in prison and he still sticks by his original story.
Well, that was the final scenes of crime for now. Next Thursday at 8, from Lambeth Lad to Robber on the Run in Rio. Friends and family, not to mention former Chief Superintendent Jack Slipper of the Yard, relate the legend of Ronnie Biggs. Next tonight, Primetime Crime continues with Arrest and Trial.